we joke about like, people don't remember all this stuff they learned in school, but they can read off or rattle off 50 Pokemon characters, right? Like because they learned it through a game and there was passion around it. And it wasn't just like someone pushing that on you, and you have to push it back. So it totally makes sense to make school and push more of this education through interactive learning rather than just kind of sitting in a desk and having a talking head telling you something.
Welcome everyone to a new episode of the Zero to Play podcast. I'm your host Carla Duke, and today I'm joined by John Podlasek. John is the Director of Talent Acquisition at Level X, podcast host at GameDevAdvice.com, and industry veteran with over 30 years experience. Today we'll be talking about the future of VR, the value behind combining game design with education, and how his perspective has changed after his multiple-decade career. A big thank you to Prismatic Studios for being our Season 6 sponsor. More on them later, but for now, sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode of the Zero to Play podcast. All right, welcome John to the show. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me on. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, so a couple of weeks ago, I appeared on your podcast, Game Dev Advice. I highly recommend it for other people wanting content like this, where they hear stories from game industry veterans and people within the industry. I think your podcast is great, and it's got a very clear structure that I think works really well. And I really appreciate having you on because you yourself have over 30 years experience in the industry. I think you might actually be the guest with the most experience, who's been in the industry for the longest that I've had on the show,
Right.
which has kind of made me think differently about what kind of questions I might want to ask. Because obviously I'm a newbie, or not a newbie. I've been in the industry for like 8 years, but the kind of the cycles of the game industry, I feel like have gone through a lot of change since you started, I can imagine. And the fact that you're still in it is really interesting. So I guess to start off, I'd love to just ask a bit about what you're doing currently at Level X, because I think that is really fascinating and something that probably didn't exist or couldn't have existed 30 years ago. So if you don't mind just explaining what Level X is and what you do there.
Yeah, I'm the Director of Talent Acquisition at Level X. We use the neuroscience of play to advance medicine through games. And we work with specialists, we work with doctors, we work with game designers, artists, programmers, and come up with different scenarios and different actual games for different verticals in the medical space. So it's cardiologists, dermatologists, pulmonologists, and we use that kind of interesting part about gameplay, like the I'm going to do better. I'm going to try and beat that score. The challenge, the problem solving that we do as all of us playing games, but we apply it to the medical field. And medical people are problem solvers. At the end of the day, just like everybody else, and they enjoy having these interesting, challenging things that they can play to actually improve their skills, get a little bit of CME, continuing medical education, and have stuff custom made for them and now their life's work, to be a doctor or a surgeon.
Yeah. So the main the main purpose of these products isn't to make money. Is it to just kind of finish the course? Like how do you measure a successful title in this space?
Yeah, we are for profit, right? So it is around building free to play games, but without in-app purchases. So then everyone's like, well, how do you make money? But if we create engagement and we create community and people are playing these, medical professionals are playing these games and getting value, we create an audience, and then we do the publishing ourselves, the user acquisition ourselves, and then we tap into the life sciences field. So that's med device, pharma, grants, and associations, and be like, hey, we have 100,000, 200,000 anesthesiologists playing our game. Is there some kind of new treatment, some kind of new device that we can partner and develop content to call it sponsored cases to put in our game? And that's the actual revenue stream, right? They work with us to make sure the MLR, medical, legal, regulatory is correct. We focus on making it engaging and fun and interesting. And then we give them metrics back around things that are like how many sessions got played in a month for those 3 levels that we developed. What was the average length of a session? and these companies normally measure engagement in seconds, and our average engagement runs between 4 to 15 minutes a session. So that's just like a
Mm.
magnitude bigger than any of these other initiatives they do, which makes them want to keep the levels that we created in our existing game live. So it's a SaaS or GaaS, games as a service at that point, and we do new content because it gets so blown away. And that's Baxter, Pfizer, Merck, Medtronic, J&J, Novartis, GSK, and even our parent company, BrainLab. We are owned by a company in Munich, Germany, that's in the digital operating room, and they do all kinds of hardware and
I love it. I
software.
love how you've really aimed at owning that niche, and
Yeah.
it's not, you're not making free to play games in just kind of education. You're focusing on the medical field, and there's enough content, there's enough brands, there's enough problems to solve in that space. I think that's
Mm-hmm.
really interesting, really exciting.
Yeah.
I I think for the most people, the games industry is the as playing games, and I think
Right.
that's what's happening in the last couple of years, in the last decade, is it's very much expanding to disrupt a lot of different industries. And I'm curious to know about your perspective, having worked at Level X and just seeing the kind of potential of gamifying these kinds of tools. Where do you see the future of this kind of content going? Like how much do you think games are going to impact the future of just the general public in the future?
Yeah. I talked with Jason Vandenberg, our creative director, and we see kind of like, games for niches, right? Like there's, games for doctors, and there'll be games for lawyers, right? And all these different areas. It's like anti-Wii bowling, right? This isn't for 8 to 80 year olds play with grandma, right? Like this is for cardiologists, interventional cardiologists in their,
Mm,
30s to 60s. But why can you not apply that to other areas where there's aptitude and training and continuing education and things that you need to do? So, I think we're just scratching the tip of the iceberg here, right? Like we want to be 10 years
mm,
from now when I say video games for doctors and people look at me like a dog whistle, right? They're like, oh, yeah. I want to be like, yeah, of course there are. Why not? Why wouldn't there be games for doctors? There's games for this, and this. So that's kind of the interesting part, to be on the cutting edge of just hyper niche games for different areas, and going,
mm.
where do you take it, and what other fields are there? And we work with NASA, right, and all these different kind of things. So it's just beyond the
Wow.
classic AAA or the indie game thing, but all these other areas you can explore with game design.
Going to the extreme, do you think that these kind of gamified experience will replace school and university one day?
Oh, definitely supplement, right? And maybe, George Jetson days totally replace it, right? So, and I'm saying that because I saw Twitter today. It was George Jetson's birthday. So I was like, wow,
Mm,
that's interesting. But yeah, I think, because you just think about like how we joke about, like, people don't remember all this stuff they learned in school, but they can read off or rattle off 50 Pokemon characters, right? Like
yeah.
because they learned it through a game and there was passion around it. And it wasn't just like
Mm,
someone pushing that on you, and you have to push it back. So it totally makes sense,
mm.
to make, school, and push more of this education through interactive learning rather than just kind of sitting in a desk and having a talking head telling you something and then you regurgitate the information back.
Yeah, this is kind of a game adjacent like
Yeah.
discussion that we're talking about. But I saw something a couple of days ago on Twitter as well. There's this medical machine called the Da Vinci machine
Yep.
or something like that, where
Very
it's
familiar
it's
with that.
got it's something that doctors operate in
Mm-hmm.
and control during operations. And the article was about how console gaming can teach you the dexterity that you need in order to operate this. So
Mm-hmm.
console game people that studied to be in the medical field and also played games growing up had a very natural
Yeah.
transition to
Hand-eye
operating a machine
coordination.
like this.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. What are your thoughts on that? And it's very different to the topic that we're talking about and what Level X does, but that's another kind of benefit, I guess, to games and these specialized fields.
Yeah. And it's just, I think it's all just around abstracting concepts and having different inputs, right? So, like, whether it's on a phone where you're just swiping and you're doing something, or if you're using a Da Vinci, which is this $2 million robot surgery device with these different inputs, right? Then there's still the hand control and different inputs. that are touch based, but then it's also through cognitive abilities and understanding what to do and how to move things. So I think it's exciting just to have gaming beyond just a controller, or a mobile device. And now some of that stuff bleeds into these kind of robotic surgeries and other kinds of things that are going on. I mean, there's
Yeah. At Level X, so you distribute, free to play mobile games. Do
Mhm.
you explore VR at all, or AR, and how does that kind of fit into the kind of progress that, well, your thoughts on where the industry is going in terms of immersion and interactivity?
Yeah. Right now we're focused on mobile because it's low friction, right? Like everyone's got a smartphone in their pocket, and then also on
Hmm.
streaming. We've developed our own streaming platform, and we're able to create these scenarios in an OR, and we can share a URL, and we can talk through and take turns demoing something right in your browser, right? Because that's the ultimate low friction. There's not even a download involved, right? It's like click on the link in your
Yeah.
browser tab. VR and AR are continuing to evolve, right? Like for a while there, everyone was like a gold rush for VR, and it didn't really pan out because there's so much friction, right? Like you gotta have a $4,000 computer, you have to have a $800 Vive, and now those barriers are coming down. So I think it's the future is bright for that as it continues to price point lowers and getting rid of being tethered, like the Oculus and stuff is interesting. AR is interesting too. Like our parent company developed some technology for neurosurgeons to take CAT scan data, and why look at it two dimensionally when you can push it into
Hmm.
the Magic Leap, right? So the Magic Leap
Hmm.
is very powerful. It's not a good business model for consumers, but in the enterprise space, if you can do something powerful and useful with it, nobody bats an eye at the cost. And the idea of
Mm.
like taking brain imaging and putting it three dimensionally so neurosurgeons can like look and visualize and plan and figure out where they're going to drill and where they're going to remove the tumor in a more holistic, realistic way is really interesting. And we got involved with that. We helped with some of the shader code. We helped some of the load times, some of the optimizations, and made it look more compelling. And it was an interesting project, and it ultimately led to us being acquired. But yeah, I think maybe there's going to be like another, surge just between price point not being tethered and things on VR, and then we'll see what happens with AR, right? Like Apple's getting in. I'm an Apple fan,
Hmm.
so I'm always kind of curious what they're going to do. And yeah, 5-10 years from now, I think it's going to be more common.
Yeah, I've been trying to think about that, and how games are kind of being lumped into all of these different situations. There's the free to play model. There's PC
Hmm.
gamers now. There's games for education, and there's this kind of growing area, and to define a game is becoming harder and
Right.
harder. And I've been trying to think of when the iPhone came out. People couldn't imagine what what this could be useful for. It was kind of so many tools in one.
Hmm.
And I'm kind of thinking the same about VR as everyone's trying to, think ahead about what it's going to be used for. And I kind of feel like that might damage the growth of it a bit.
Yeah.
But the hearing that companies like Apple are getting into it, I think is really interesting, because I think that they kind of understand that model really
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. And they're never first to market, but when they do come in, it's always a very smart move, and they tend to dominate. So yeah, let's see what happens. And I remember, when the iPhone came out, it was just the novelty of it, and everyone's like, "Oh, it's never going to work. There's no keyboard." I got it in my BlackBerry, and it just obliterated. Like,
Mm.
where's the BlackBerry now, right? So yeah, who knows? Who knows what new and interesting ways people are going to do things? Um,
Yeah, yeah,
it's the sky's the limit.
yeah, exactly. It's a real hard challenge, because as soon as you move into like a 3D virtual space or a 3D
Mm,
environment, just everything, I feel like within a phone, at least it feels kind of
right.
manageable. Within a 3D environment, I feel like the options for how you can improve the UX and the UI and all that is just, there's millions and millions of
Mm,
possibilities. I think it's going to be an interesting challenge for them to try and
right.
solve.
Well, plus the
Um,
fatigue thing and stuff too, right? Like you can sit there on a phone for
yeah, yeah.
hours and not think about it. If you're in VR for hours, that's pretty exhausting. And that whole sensory
Mm,
deprivation thing. yeah, how do you deal with that? And maybe AR is the way so that you don't feel like you're just, shut off from the world. Like you can still see some of your stuff around you, and it doesn't feel so isolated.
Yeah, I put a Meta Quest 2 on a couple weeks ago, and I'd put on previously. I'd worn Magic Leap
Hmm.
devices, the HTC Vive, and the Meta. It was the first time I wore a Meta Quest 2, and just setting up your room is such a nicer experience because they've put cameras on the front
Yeah.
now, so that there's this kind of infrared view in the real. I wouldn't call it augmented
Okay.
reality, but it's enough so that you have kind of perspective and visibility of what's around you while you're scanning your room, so that it can perform the VR experiences and kind of maps out the layout. And that was a really huge difference for me, because before you'd put on a
Yeah.
headset and then you'd practically be
Right.
blind, and just have to trust that it understands your
Right.
environment.
And you're moving around and you bump into something, even though you're trying to map it earlier in the Vive. Yeah, I've ran into those problems when you're playing something very
Yeah.
kinetic. You know.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I'm curious to see how in the next 10 years we start engaging with technology like that the Apple headset coming out, and who knows, things like this podcast might be in virtual spaces. I'm
Yeah.
actually almost certain that podcast recordings will be in virtual spaces. It'll be like a virtual talk show
Right.
type
Yeah.
situation, and people have to create their own 3D virtual
Hmm.
scenes for your guests to come in. So I'm curious about that, and I'm sure both you and I would probably leap at the opportunity to use tools like that once they become more readily
Yeah.
available.
Yeah. To see what you can do with
Um,
them. Yeah, for sure.
yeah. So I'd like to take I'd like a I'd like to take a step back, just because I don't want to miss the opportunity while having you on the podcast. Is going back 30 years to what the industry was like in the late 80s when you started.
Yeah.
I think you have an incredible perspective with this kind of time frame that you've been in the industry, and I'd love to know just like what was what was the feeling or the vibe of the games industry back then, because I think it's changed
Yeah.
incredibly. It's just become a lot more mainstream, a lot more talked about. But what was it like when you got your first job in the industry back
Yeah.
then?
It was obviously a lot smaller, a lot more kind of grassroots. There weren't a lot of, venues for games, right? It was either um, console, which was where I started on the TurboGrafx 16. For anyone that remembers that, right? Bonk's Adventure, Bomberman, all that. So you made console games for like Genesis or the TurboGrafx, or later the SNES, or kind of PC, right? And PC in the sense it
Hmm.
could be Amiga, but it could be IBM, or it could be something else. But those were kind of like the two the two venues, and it was always you know there was no digital distribution, so it was all about box product, and it was making those certain windows, right? Like the whole game industry was around that 6 week window between Thanksgiving and Christmas. The games have to hit then, because that's when 60% of the games would be bought for the entire year. So that kind of led to a lot of
Hmm.
crunch back then too, because you had that hard deadline, and that was the big glut. And
Mm.
the costs were high. When you put a game on a cartridge, there was a lot of costs involved, and there would often be fights early in development with like 32 or 64 meg or whatever it was, because it would really kick up the cost, and the margins were super thin. So like if you ordered a bunch of games, or you had them manufactured as a company and then you shipped them to retail and they didn't move, retail would be like, not our problem. Toys R Us would be like, ship it back, and then you'd have to eat all that cost. And then conversely, if you didn't make enough, you couldn't turn the faucet back on because the manufacturing times were months. So you had like that one shot to hit that
Mm.
holiday window. So and then just getting shelf space, there was end caps, and people, it would cost a lot of money, and sometimes the big publishers would squeeze out the smaller folks at the Babbages and the stores, um, and then PC was a little bit more um, indie in that sense, and the cost of goods was just floppy disks, so it was lower and stuff. But there wasn't a lot of real avenues. There was no such thing really for the most part as indie, because you needed that distribution arm to get the game into people's hands. There was no downloading, or people were on modems back then.
Mm.
You could do some stuff with BBSs and uh, demos and freemium, or excuse me, they used to bundle games on floppy disks to get in people's hands. I think it was like Zoom had
Mm-hmm.
partnerships like 7-Eleven where you buy a Slurpee and you get a floppy to play Doom and stuff like that. So had to come up with creative ways to get content out because there was no online avenues. It was all physical goods. And it was very teams were smaller. Um, Technology was a heck of a lot cruder. Yeah, it was much
Mm.
different time.
Is there anything that you feel like you miss from that time? That because, yeah, is there anything that you just feel like has gone in a completely opposite direction, and something that you really treasured or admired about that time that you wouldn't mind
Yeah,
seeing
it
again?
was working on a small game with a small team was kind of enjoyable because it wasn't that scale of, especially like AAA now is just like insane with hundreds and thousands of people.
Mm-hmm.
It would be 6 or 8 people
Mm-hmm.
and 6 to 9 month dev cycle and get it out and see what happens. Like the first game I produced was Beavis and Butthead Wiener Takes All, and that was mid 90s. It was basically rip off You Don't Know Jack, throw some Beavis and Butthead trivia, put it in a box, $20, be part of the Cheap Clicks lineup. And that was kind of a fun project to work on, just
Mm-hmm.
to work with Beavis and Butthead and have a small team of people that we all kind of worked closely together and made a game.
Yeah, I'm curious about your journey and how you've gone from, I believe it's
Yeah.
QA to production, and then now you're in talent acquisition. And I'm curious to know what, like, do you miss being part of a dev team and kind of on boots on the ground, helping a team get to a finish line, or has talent acquisition given you kind of a new sense of passion for the
Yeah,
industry?
well, kind of both. Like I do, miss working on stuff and organizing and problem solving and shipping it and being able to say, yeah, I have my hands on that. I contributed. Now talent acquisition is just a new set of challenges, right? Like it's finding people and interviewing and finding people who are good fits for the kind of roles we have. I kind of unofficially had been kind of preparing for this for decades because back in the early to mid 90s, I was managing QA. So I would start, looking at resumes, interviewing people, building a team. Like we had 20, 24 software testers at Viacom New Media. So I'd been interviewing and reviewing resumes for decades before I kind of made this switch at Level X, saying, you know what, I've been doing that anyway, and I can help grow the company that way. So um, it was always kind of like in the back of my mind, but I never really focused on it. But it was one day it just kind of made sense. And yeah, I love the challenge of finding good people and telling them about our mission and having them join the company and contribute. And when I hear someone like, yeah, this person, blah blah blah, you hired is doing awesome. That's where I get satisfaction now versus like that's my
Mm.
game on that TV commercial or whatever it is.
Yeah. Yeah, I believe you're hiring for a few roles as well. Do you mind? Do you want to just kind of mention those in case anyone
Oh yeah,
listening
yeah.
might be the right fit?
I've got like 20 roles open, right? So it's a lot of game dev.
Okay.
So it's engineers on the management side that are can write code, but also know how to manage and mentor engineers. That's a big push. And then producers. I just hired one Thursday, and we're adding to our production team. So producers and senior producers working in Jira, working with stakeholders, working with the
Hmm.
artists, designers, medical people, stuff like that. Those are some of the big ones I'm trying to fill right now. Data engineer. Yeah.
Yeah, 20 roles is a lot. How big is the
We're about
company?
135 right now, and that 20 roles kind of spreads across into marketing and sales and other areas that
Mm.
I'm not too involved in because that's not my wheelhouse, right? Like my wheelhouse is game devs and talking to game developers. But yeah, it's probably about uh, 10 to 14 game dev roles and some other roles in operations, sales, marketing, stuff like that. And yeah, we hired 60 people last year.
Yeah.
And or 100% remote in the U.S.
Wow.
And yeah, it's a good time.
I think if my memory is right, you started your job during COVID at
No, it's
Level
pre-COVID.
X. Um,
Yeah, yeah. I've been there about
okay.
5.5 years now.
So
Yeah.
one question I had. Oh, awesome! Oh, that's great. So my question's a lot more valuable then. I'd love to know what how things have changed for a talent
Yeah.
acquirer over COVID. You know, what kind of processes have changed? I'm sure networking
Hmm.
is a huge one. How has your process changed, and how do you kind of go about finding talent at the
Yeah,
moment in the
the
industry?
process is in a lot of ways been simplified because we used to have to fly people in and do the interviews and all the in-person stuff, and now I just spend all my days just on Zoom and phone calls, right? So it's kind of easier, and I can really stack more interviews, and we can talk to more people because it doesn't have that complication of flying in from California or Texas or whatever.
This episode of the Zero to Play podcast is brought to you by Prismatic Studios. Prismatic Studios is an Unreal Engine technical consultancy based in Auckland, New Zealand, focusing on development services for clients that need support prototyping, implementing and testing features, or adding development resources to existing projects. With their expertise using Unreal Engine, they can help consult and work alongside your teams to avoid common pitfalls that are so common in software and game development these days. Reach out to them today for a quote or free consultation. A link to their website can be found in the description below. Back to the show. Yeah, so definitely
Mm-hmm.
things being done remotely, like over Zoom and over phone calls, is relevant. One question I have, just from my personal experience, has your podcast been a way of networking more? Like, have you crossed over that line of using your podcast to help find talent, and vice versa? Has kind of talent helped find guests for your podcast, or has that been like a line you haven't
Yeah, I mean, it
tried to
overlaps a
cross?
little bit. The podcast was never the intent to do it solely for talent acquisition. It was more just to share stories, like from people I've worked with over the years and kind of their journeys. But it definitely contributes. It doesn't hurt. It's interesting when I reach out to somebody and they're like, "Oh yeah, I've heard of the podcast," right? That makes it uh, positive, and it gives them a little bit of uh, insight into who I am and stuff like that. So they kind of, yeah, it overlaps in the kind of feed off each other. And yeah, through work, like I'll be like, wow, I was in a meeting with that person. I should have Jason on the podcast. So sometimes then I'll just interview someone from the company. Done that a couple times too, just because they had an interesting story. So yeah, they kind of feed off each other, and it's kind of a good synergy, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, I have a few follow-on questions about your podcast. So game dev advice for anyone listening, you can go to gamedevadvice.com to see all the links to all the different
Mm-hmm.
platforms. But what was your inspiration to get the podcast started? Why did you record that first
Um,
episode?
yeah, I was in the kitchen once at work and just talking about something, and Ryan Blake, art director, he just kind of was like, "You should have a podcast. You have all these stories, right?" Because like I've I have my scars. I've seen a lot of stuff, and I was like, "Huh, yeah, that's not maybe." And then I just went online and I found some online course for $19, and I signed up and I took it, and then started researching it, and then just kind of just chipped away and had a logo designed, and um, just kind of said, well, let's just see how this goes. So that was 20 early 2019 is when I launched my first one. I'm not very disciplined about the consistency, like unlike you, who are very good about it. They come out about every 4 to 6 weeks. So it's just kind of more of I do it when I have time, and because I do all the editing myself and stuff. But yeah, I find it interesting, just to connect with new people or connect with old people. And sometimes I find guests on Twitter. I mean, that's how I learned about you, right? I was just looking at my Twitter scroll, and you had a lot of
Yeah.
good insights into production. I was like, oh, I should reach out to this Carl guy.
Yeah, that's how I make most of my connections, as well as through Twitter. It's funny though, because the discipline I've had is kind of dwindling a bit, and I do feel like next year is going to be a different phase of the podcast. We'll see.
Mm,
I have twins arriving in a couple months,
that's
with my
right.
wife and I, so I'm going to have to reassess
I have twins,
my routine a bit.
but mine are 21, so they're
But
it's a very different scenario that they're not
yeah,
around much. And but yeah, when you have twin newborns, it's going to definitely change your schedule.
yeah, unless I
Yeah,
invite them
there
to
you
the
go.
podcast with me, but I haven't. Don't know
Yeah.
if I'll risk that just yet. Um, so
Hmm.
last question I had about your podcast was, what do you hope to, where do you hope it kind of leads to in the future after doing it for 3 years? You must have thought long and hard about, should I continue doing this, and kind of where your
Yeah.
north star is. I'd love to know what that
Yeah.
areas that you're
I
working
need to.
towards with that,
I need
if there
to
is
move
any.
into video, right? So like what we're doing now, that's I'm always in the back of my mind. And I was like, I have to
Mm,
edit Zoom files, but now there's Riverside and stuff like that. So, um, and then just I like to see the reach of it, and just to see that it's about 55% North America, 45% everywhere else. So it's always for me kind of cool just to look at that
mhm,
map of the world and be like, wow, there's a cluster of people listening in Brazil, and wow, it's big in Australia now, or so
mm,
just having that message and to talk to people about their journey and how they got in, because everyone, you just think about, and I'm sure it happens to you, like, oh, you make video games, you should talk to my son or daughter, they want to make video games, right? So there's, I can't count how many times that's
yeah,
happened to me over 30 some years. So the fact that now there's a podcast and I kind of talk about that journey, but then I also say, well, it's not just for people that want to get their foot in the door. Once you're in, then what do you do to move forward in your career? And then funny stories and thoughts in the future, and just I like the conversations. I don't like the editing, but I like just connecting with new
yeah.
people, and then just connecting with old people, like old friends. And I'm editing one right now with a guy named Yuri Hornman. I haven't seen in 25 years, and I just hit him up on LinkedIn. It's like, hey, let's connect. And so
Wow.
I'm just doing those kind of things, and just kind of spreading that information, and hearing the positive feedback. People, the feedback's been good.
Yeah. I look forward to that conversation. I think having a chat with someone that you
Yeah,
knew in a previous
plural
decade
decades.
is
Yeah,
really interesting. I'm
yeah,
fascinated about, yeah, about how that conversation goes.
yeah.
Not to put you on the spot, but is there one story or one person that you've interviewed that comes to mind that you wouldn't mind sharing? It doesn't have to be the greatest episode, but just some person that has an interesting story that you've had on your podcast that you think you'd
Yeah.
like to share.
Jason Vandenberg, who's our creative director, is a pretty well known creative director, right? Designer, and he's worked on For Honor. That was like his vision, um, and really interesting, compelling person. And we were talking about he used to work for Ubisoft, and he was up in Montreal, and they were researching the TV show Mythic Quest, right, which is kind of like that uh, fake mockumentary about working in the game industry. And there were people there from the show, and they saw him. And Jason has a very unique look. He's got a cowboy hat and a long beard and stuff like that. And the people walked up to him, because they were just, who is this person? What do you do here? And he's like, I make worlds, man. And that was like, so then he would get into all this talk about game design and worlds and imagination, and it ends up that was like part of the inspiration behind that show and getting it greenlit. Supposedly is what I've heard from him, that it part of the character
Wow.
is even based on his personality and stuff. So that kind of stuff. And it's on Apple TV, and you can watch it. With the guy from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. So yeah, it's just, I found that one to be pretty entertaining. That
Hmm.
you know your personality gets tied into a TV show and stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, no, that's cool. I'm sure we'll only hear more stories like this in the future as games become more more mainstream. Just, I mean, not just games. I mean, I saw just last week Dungeons and
Oh,
Dragons live action movies coming out, and it's just, yeah, I just feel like games are
right.
becoming more mainstream with just being talked about in TV shows more, being used
Hmm.
as inspiration for projects, and yeah, I'm sure we're just going to see more of that, and I'm
Yeah,
wondering where that kind of line is, where how much games
right.
can become a part of culture, and even like in music and things like that. I feel like there's still a
Hmm.
lot to hear about how much games have impacted people's lives, because so many kids were gamers growing up, and now they can
Right.
feel comfortable talking about it, whereas 30 years ago that
Right.
might have been
Well, no,
the minority.
that's the other part too. Is
When
like
it's generally
when I
speaking.
became a gamer, it was the television, or you would go to the arcade, right? And there was not everyone went to the arcade, and it was always like, oh,
Yeah.
that's where the burnouts go and all that kind of stuff. So it was very kind of like just a subset of people who would go there. But I loved the arcade experience, and it was you know this is back basically Stranger Times, right? Like that's when I grew up in the '80s, and in the arcade there was something magical
Mm,
about going in the arcade, but it was still very very niche, right? Like it wasn't mainstream, and now you
hmm.
know these stats like 70% of people play a game at least one. All it's especially when you go to smartphones, right? Because everyone's got one of
Yeah.
those. It's just broadened the appeal where it wasn't just like
Yeah.
kind of nerdy people playing it in the arcade or playing it on a television. Yeah, it's really
Games
gone
for
mainstream,
everyone. Yeah. Yeah. And now
right?
there's games for doctors, and maybe soon lawyers as well. Which, yeah, that's a really fascinating part. Is
Hmm.
is who isn't who isn't in a position
Right.
to be kind of targeted at a game in the future. And I feel like that's what's so universal about games as a medium, is that it can really
Hmm.
be targeted to anyone. It's which is, yeah, really exciting for the medium. Yeah, I guess you could have a book. You could have a book that's marketed to absolutely anyone, depending on what the topic is, and same thing for
Yeah.
games now, which is really exciting to see. I know I said I asked my last question about your podcast, but one thing
Hmm.
that's been stuck in my mind that I want to ask is there anyone um, that you would just pass out at the sight of seeing if they emailed you tomorrow saying that they'd want to appear on your podcast? Is there like a dream guest
Yeah.
that you've maybe tried to get, or that you are just holding out for the opportunity to reach out to them? Is it like the kind of ideal guest that you would
Um,
like to speak to one day?
yeah, I don't know. I've met a lot of people who are kind of like industry people, right? So that are I'm not like in awe of all of them. You know what I mean? It's just like, oh yeah, I could have that person on or something, but there's no one person I can think of
Mm,
that'd be like the holy grail of having on my guest or on my show as a guest. Um, yeah, maybe like Nolan
mm,
Bushnell, right? Like going back to the early days. Yeah, like we're connected on LinkedIn, but
that's
that doesn't
Harvey.
really
Yeah,
mean anything. But to have him on to talk about what it was like
yeah,
back in the '70s, right? Which makes me seem like a punk compared to him because of his
yeah.
OG status, right? So yeah, maybe Nolan Bushnell. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like you'd be a good interviewer for someone like him, because you have that perspective. Whereas if I asked him questions, I would, yeah, I'd probably fall flat after a couple, and not, yeah, no, like I wouldn't have understood the perspective that
Yeah.
it was like back then in those days. So yeah, if he came
Please
through
do.
my network, I'll definitely pass him on to yours, because I'd much rather hear an episode with you in it. Um, yeah, no, that's awesome. I guess that's kind of all the questions that I had for today. I'd love to know where people, if like people listening want to kind of continue following your
Hmm.
journey. I've already mentioned gamedevadvice.com, but where else would you like people to
Yeah, on
connect with you,
you know
that are listening right now?
Twitter, right? So it's Game Dev Advice on Twitter, and then my personal one is John Podlasek, Podlask, but I tend to focus more not so much on the game side, just more about other stuff on that. Um, but yeah, the Twitter is probably the best place to connect and stuff. Um, LinkedIn, if you're not a recruiter that's going to try and sell me on your services, because I get those people bugging me all the time. I'm like, no, I don't need to be getting an invite. But yeah, Twitter's probably the best spot to connect
Yeah.
and build rapport and just hang out and see each other's feeds and stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I usually like to end the podcast with
Mm-hmm.
one kind of piece of advice that's shared. So if you could give a piece of advice for navigating the next 10 years of the industry. So you've obviously survived the gauntlet that is the industry
Yeah.
as it's evolved over the last 30 years. What advice would you give for staying involved in this industry that's probably going to change an incredible amount in the next 10 years in ways that we can't imagine right now? What advice would you give for someone wanting to just
Yeah,
stay
I would
committed to
say,
this industry in the long term?
be curious and don't be afraid to learn new things, right? Like the people that are like, well, that's just the way you do it, and have that kind of closed mindset. Um, they don't kind of stay in the industry. So being able to adapt, knowing that things are going to change, and not be intimidated by it, but just understand that's just how it is, and you have to embrace that the change and stay curious and want to learn new things, because otherwise you're just going to fall by the wayside, and you're going to be not working or not um, able to really contribute
Hmm.
in ways if you just think in a very fixed way. So, yeah, take classes, go online, listen to podcasts. What YouTube is just insane. There's so much content, right? Especially if you're an artist and stuff. Like you can learn so much through quality YouTube tutorials, and just be passionate about that, and just always keep growing, expanding, and learning, and having an open mind. It's kind of the high level perspective.
That's actually really good advice, and I don't think I've had someone say it like that before with that angle, and I think it perfectly sums up your journey in the industry. It sums up the ethos behind your podcast and why you do what you do, and even just yeah, just the job that you're in now. It's
Mm-hmm.
very much new and emerging, and it's not something that even people today, aren't very familiar with. The kind of games that you're making at Level X. So it's
Thanks.
really awesome, and I think it's really good advice.
Cool.
So thank you so much for your time today on the show, and
Well,
I
thank you,
hope you
Carl,
have
for having me
a
on.
good rest of your
I
day. Thank
appreciate
you
the chance to
for
connect
coming
like
on.
this and talk. And yeah, thank you for being on my podcast. And I'm glad to be on today. So thanks.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Zero to Play podcast. We hope you learned something about game development, the games industry as a whole, or the future of games. Follow us on Twitter at Zero to Play and let us know what you found valuable. Take care and see you in the next episode.